Let me tell you something before I start. I am not a hero. I want to be real clear about that because every single version of this story that's been floating around the galactic net for the past 8 months has me doing something dramatic or noble or calculated. Like I sat down one night and decided to change the course of interspecies diplomacy by doing something poetic. That is not what happened. What happened is that I was cold, I was tired, I hadn't eaten a real meal in 3 days, and a woman was bleeding in an alley next to a busted atmospheric recycler that smelled like copper and old circuit boards. And I did what any person does when someone is hurt right in front of them. I helped. That's the whole story, really. The rest of it, the politics, the war ceasefire, the tribunal, the 18 months of hearings, the new accord clause they named after me that I still can't fully pronounce, all of that came after. All of that was consequence. What I did in that alley took maybe 45 seconds. But I'll tell you all of it, because the Interspecies Accord Commission asked me to. And because honestly, I think people deserve to know what actually happened instead of the version the hegemony keeps broadcasting where I'm apparently some kind of calculated insurgent. I was not a calculated insurgent. I was a dock worker from Ohio who'd been living on Varon Station for 6 years. Varon Station is not a nice place. I want you to understand the geography of where this happened, because it matters. Varon Station sits at the crossover point between human-controlled space and what the hegemony calls the Outer Consolidated Territories, which is their polite way of saying the rim of space they've colonized, taxed into poverty and largely forgotten. The station is cylindrical, rotating to generate about 0.7 standard gravity, which means everything feels slightly too light, slightly off, like you're always just a little bit drunk. The inner ring is commerce, docking berths, customs processing, trade floors. The middle ring is residential, cramped, loud, smelling of 100 different species cooking. The outer ring is industrial, manufacturing, recycling, atmospheric processing, power distribution. I lived in the middle ring, section 14B, which is the part of Varon Station most humans call the soft middle, not dangerous enough to be exciting, not nice enough to be comfortable. Just a corridor of stacked housing units, a few food vendors, a communal hydration station, and a recycling intake facility that hummed day and night like a giant mechanical insect. I worked the docks, third shift, which on a space station means nothing in terms of actual time, but culturally it means you're working when most of the station is asleep, when the corridors are dark except for the amber maintenance lighting, when the only other people you see are other third shifters and the automated cleaning units and, occasionally, hegemony patrol units doing their rounds. The hegemony patrol units are worth describing because they're going to come up. The hegemony, formally, the Consolidated Galactic Hegemony, is a governing body that spans about 60% of explored space and covers 47 recognized intelligent species. Humans have been a provisional member for 31 years, which means we pay hegemony taxes and follow hegemony trade regulations, but don't have a voting seat on the High Council and can be subject to hegemony military jurisdiction in border territories, which Varon Station is. Their soldiers, a Hegemony Standard Force, HSF, are a mixed species unit, but the ones stationed at Varon were predominantly Krath. The Krath are, how do I describe this without sounding like I'm making a species generalization? They're tall. About 2.5 meters, most of them. They have an exoskeletal outer layer that looks like dark chitinous plating, faces that red as emotionless to human eyes, because their primary emotional expression is chemical rather than visual. And they move with this slow, deliberate quality that humans tend to interpret as arrogance, but is actually just how they process spatial information. They were not kind to the humans on Varon Station. Not cruel exactly, not in a boots-on-necks way, more in a bureaucratic, dismissive, we have authority and you are provisional way. Random document checks, cargo searches with no stated cause, housing inspections, a noise ordinance that applied only to human-occupied sections, and had a decibel limit so low that normal conversation technically violated it after station night. We dealt with it. You deal with things when there's nowhere else to go and you're 6 years into a work contract that pays in hegemony credits that are only valid on stations like this one. The night it happened, and I'm going to keep calling it the night, even though technically it was station cycle 14 of the 3rd month, because it was night in my head. It was dark and quiet and it felt like night. I was walking home from my shift. 3rd shift ends at what the station calls 0400 standard. The corridors in the outer ring are nearly empty at that hour. The amber lights are on their lowest setting. The atmospheric recyclers, big industrial units about the size of a cargo container, cycle through their maintenance purge at that hour, which means they make this rhythmic mechanical exhaling sound, like something breathing. I was taking the shortcut through Maintenance Corridor 7. I took that shortcut every single morning after 3rd shift because it cut 12 minutes off my walk, and 12 minutes is 12 minutes. It runs alongside the secondary recycler units, and it's narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. And it's dark even by outer ring standards because it's technically a maintenance access route and not supposed to be a pedestrian thoroughfare. But every 3rd shift dock worker used it. Station security knew we used it. Nobody cared. I was about 2/3 of the way through when I heard it. A sound. Not the recyclers, not the usual ambient hum. Something wet. Something that came in small, struggling increments, like breathing but wrong, like someone breathing through something that was blocking them. I stopped. The sound was coming from the left. There's a small alcove there. I'd walked past it probably 300 times and never paid attention to it. It's where the maintenance access panels are, and there's just enough space between the panels and the recycler housing for a person to wedge into. I turned my work light on. She was sitting in the alcove, pressed back against the maintenance panel, legs stretched out in front of her, one hand pressed against the left side of her torso. My first thought, and I am not going to pretend it wasn't, was veil. Because she was veil. The veil are they're complicated in the context of hegemony politics. They're one of the oldest species in the consolidated galactic hegemony. Ancient, by most measures. Their civilization predates most of the other species on the High Council by somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years, depending on which historical record you consult. They joined the hegemony during what's called the Second Consolidation, about 600 years ago, as a voluntary full member. They were never conquered, never coerced. They negotiated their own terms. But here's the thing about the veil that makes them politically complicated. They require biological material from other species to survive. Not in a predatory way. Or it started as predatory, a long time ago, the same way humans eating other animals is predatory. But the veil evolved past that. They developed what their own medical literature calls the accord metabolism, a biological need for genetic material from other species that they fulfill through a process called the sharing, a voluntary exchange. They give something of themselves. Their saliva has extraordinary healing properties, genuinely extraordinary. There are hegemony medical certifications built around it, and they receive blood. A small amount, enough. The political problem is that about 300 years ago, when the hegemony was going through one of its periodic xenophobic governance phases, the veil were reclassified. Their sharing practice was declared a form of biological assault. Their full member status was suspended. They were given provisional status, the same as humans but worse because they'd been full members before. They'd had a council seat. They'd had rights. And then those rights were systematically removed, codified into law, and enforced by the hegemony standard force. The Veil were not allowed to practice the sharing on any hegemony station or territory without explicit written consent from both the Hegemony Medical Board and the Donor Species Council, which, for humans, did not exist because humans didn't have a species council. Provisional members don't. Which meant Veil on Varan Station were essentially left to starve slowly because they had no legal mechanism to obtain what they needed. This is what I knew, sitting on the outer ring of Varan Station, shining my work light on a Veil woman bleeding in an alley. She looked, and I want to describe this carefully, because she was beautiful and I don't want that to be the thing people focus on. But it was the first thing I noticed, so I'm going to be honest about it. She looked like what you'd get if someone painted a person out of moonlight and cold water. The Veil are humanoid, not humanoid. Similar general structure, but the differences are there if you look. Their skin has a luminescent quality, not glowing, more like the way a pearl glows, holding light from somewhere inside it. Their eyes are large and dark, almost entirely pupil, with a very thin rim of color. Hers was a deep amber, like old honey held up to sunlight. Their hair is dark, usually, and fine, and tends to float slightly in low-gravity environments as if it hasn't quite committed to falling. She was wearing Veil traditional clothing, which is layered and flowing, and not at all suited for the industrial alcove she was sitting in. The left side of her clothing was dark with blood. She looked at my work light and flinched. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said, which is a stupid thing to say, I know, but I said it. She didn't speak, she just watched me. "You're bleeding," I said, also obvious. I'm great at stating things. She moved her hand slightly from her side, just a fraction, and I could see the wound. A cut, long on the left side of her rib cage, not deep enough to be immediately fatal, but deep enough to be serious. Deep enough to have been bleeding long enough that she was past the point of looking scared and into the place where you're just quietly holding on. "Krath," she said. Her voice was soft, with that faint resonance the Veil have, like there's a secondary harmonic just below the main sound. "Patrol." I understood immediately. The HSF patrol had found her, either doing the sharing with someone or trying to, and they'd done this. I felt something go hot and clean in my chest. Not heroic, not noble, just angry. The kind of angry that doesn't make speeches. I crouched down. I'm not a medic. I want to be clear. I have basic first aid training, doc workers have to, but I know wound treatment, not alien biology. I did not know if what I was about to do would help or hurt or do nothing. But she needed pressure on the wound, and she needed fluid. Blood loss is blood loss, regardless of species. That much basic biology is universal. And she needed to not be sitting in this alcove alone at 04:00 while she got weaker. I took off my jacket. It's a work jacket, heavy, synthetic, designed for cargo bay environments. I folded it and pressed it against her side. She made a sound, small, pain. "Sorry," I said, "you need pressure." "I'm going to hold it." She looked at me with those amber-rimmed dark eyes, and I could see her trying to calculate something. Trying to figure out what I was, why I was helping, whether this was a trap. "I'm Marcus," I said. "I work the docks. I live in Section 14B. I'm just a person who walked by." I kept my voice level and quiet, the way you talk to something scared. "You're safe. I'm not calling anyone." She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "Saren." "Saren," I repeated. "Okay, hi, can you tell me how long you've been bleeding?" "Some hours," she said. Some hours. Sitting in this alcove alone for hours, bleeding into the maintenance corridor while the station slept around her. "Okay," I said, "okay. Here's where it gets complicated. Here's the part that every newscast and political analysis and hegemony tribunal transcript gets wrong, or glosses over, or interprets through a lens that has nothing to do with what actually happened in that moment." After about 10 minutes of me holding pressure on the wound, Saren said, very quietly, I need to ask you something. Ask, I said. The blood, she paused. Not much, a small amount from your hand, a cut, nothing more. It would. She stopped. I would not ask if I didn't need it to survive the night. I want to be completely honest about my internal process here. I was scared. I won't pretend I wasn't. Not of her. She was barely staying conscious, and she was in no position to threaten anyone. Scared of the concept. Scared of doing something I didn't understand. Scared of the hegemony regulations that made this technically illegal on Varen's station. Scared of being found in this corridor with a wounded veil and evidence of having committed an act of voluntary sharing. I thought about all of that. And then I thought, she's going to die. Right here in this corridor. She's going to bleed out alone at 04:30 station time in a maintenance alcove, and I'm going to walk home to my housing unit and lie awake staring at the ceiling. Tell me how, I said. She blinked. I don't think she expected that answer. She told me. Her saliva, she explained softly, precisely, like she was reading from a medical document, contains a compound that accelerates coagulation. If I allowed her to receive a small amount of blood, she could apply her saliva to her own wound, and the bleeding would stop significantly within minutes. The blood I gave, she said it simply, clinically, would provide what her metabolism needed to maintain consciousness long enough for her body to begin repair. Does it hurt? I asked. Not for you, she said. A small cut, less than a needle. I pulled out the multi-tool I carry on my belt. Every dock worker has one. It has a cutting edge that I use for packaging seals. I made a small cut on the inside of my left palm. It stung, not badly. I held my hand toward her. What happened next I'm going to describe carefully, because it's been described badly in almost every public account. She took my hand in both of hers. Her hands were cold, veil run at a lower body temperature than humans. She held my hand as carefully as you'd hold something fragile. She pressed her lips to the cut, barely, for maybe 3 seconds. It didn't hurt. It felt like pressure, warmth, surprisingly, where her lips touched despite the cold of her hands, and then a sensation that I can only describe as a faint vibration, something running up the inside of my arm and settling in my chest, not unpleasant, just present, just there. Then she lifted her head. Her eyes were brighter. The amber rim was more visible. Some immediate physical thing had changed. She was more present in her own face. She placed her other hand against her wound, and I watched the bleeding slow. Not stop immediately, but slow dramatically, over about 4 minutes, until it had reduced to almost nothing. Thank you, she said. Does it heal completely? I asked. No, not fully, but enough to move, enough to live. Where do you live? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. On the station, she said, which told me she didn't have a fixed address, which told me a lot. Come with me, I said. I took her to my housing unit. Section 14B, Unit 47. It's 12 square meters. 1 sleeping platform, 1 sanitation unit, a food preparation corner, and a window that looks out into the interior of the station cylinder. So I have a view of the opposite side of the ring about 300 meters away, which sounds sad and actually kind of is. But there's something peaceful about it at night, watching the amber maintenance lights on the far wall. I gave her my sleeping platform. I sat in the chair by the food prep corner. She slept for 6 hours. I did not sleep. I sat in the chair and thought about what I'd done and what it meant and what came next. At some point, I made myself something hot to drink. The reconstituted coffee substitute that's all you can get in this part of the station. And I sat and listened to the station breathe, and thought about the veil, and thought about Saren, and thought about the blood on my work jacket that I'd have to figure out how to explain if anyone noticed. When she woke up, she sat up slowly and looked at me with those dark eyes for a long moment before she said anything. You stayed up, she said. Someone had to, I said. Why? And it was a genuine question, not rhetorical. She actually wanted to know. I thought about it. Because you were hurt and alone, I said. That's enough. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, Marcus Dalen Voss. Yeah. I need to tell you something about what happened last night. I put down my coffee substitute. Tell me. She told me in careful pieces, the way someone tells you something when they're afraid of how you'll react. The sharing she'd asked me for, small as it was, carried consequences she hadn't fully disclosed in the moment, because she'd been afraid I'd say no, and she'd needed me to say yes. The veil sharing is not a one-way biological exchange. When she received blood from me and applied her healing compound to herself in the same moment, a process began. Her species biology, ancient and complex in ways that took her some time to explain, had evolved the sharing as a bonding mechanism, not just a feeding mechanism, a recognition mechanism. Her body had cataloged what I was biologically, and mine, and here she paused and looked at my hands, and then at me, mine had begun to respond. The vibration, I said, up my arm. She nodded. What does that mean? It means, she said carefully, that your body has accepted a marker. From mine. It's called the recognition. It happens rarely. It requires a specific biological compatibility. We don't entirely understand the mechanism ourselves. It's been debated in veil medicine for centuries. What does it do? I said. She folded her hands in her lap. It changes some things, she said. Slowly, over time, nothing dramatic immediately, but your healing rate will increase. Your sensory processing will begin to widen. Some veil biological traits may develop partially. You won't become veil. You'll remain human, but you'll be, she paused. Touched, she finally said. That's the word we use. I sat with that for a moment. Is it reversible? I asked. No, she said. I'm sorry. Did you know this would happen when you asked me? She met my eyes. I suspected it was possible, she said. I didn't know it would happen. The compatibility is rare. I've shared with others and it didn't happen. I should have told you. I know. There's no justification for not telling you. I looked at her. She looked back. I was dying, she said, and it wasn't an excuse, just the fact of it. I know, I said. I'd like to tell you that the next part of the story was peaceful. That Saren and I had some kind of gentle, gradual discovery period where I slowly developed veil traits while she helped me understand them, and we figured it out together like adults. That did not happen. What happened instead is that 8 days later, an HSF patrol showed up at my door. 4 Krath soldiers, led by a Krath officer with rank markings I later learned meant 3rd Prefect. They came at 11:00 station time, which was the middle of my sleep cycle. The knock on my door was less a knock and more what happens when a being who weighs 400 pounds in human standard gravity decides to communicate through a door panel. I opened the door. The 3rd Prefect, his name was Groth, I learned later, which among Krath is an entirely unremarkable name, like calling someone John, looked at me with the flat, expressionless face that Krath have, the face that humans read as hostile, but is just their resting state. Marcus Dalen Voss, he said. Human, doc registration 4471C. That's me, I said. You are required to attend a station compliance review, immediately. I'm going to describe the compliance review room, because it tells you everything about how Varen Station actually functions. It's in the inner ring in the administrative sector, clean, bright. Lit with the cool blue-white light that the Krath prefer, which is slightly too bright for human eyes, not enough to be physically painful, but enough to keep you permanently slightly uncomfortable. The chairs are sized for Krath, so sitting in them means your feet don't quite reach the floor, which I suspect is not accidental. The table is high for the same reason. There were 3 people across from me. Groth, the third prefect, a hegemony administrative officer, a species called Melvari, which are smaller, more round, covered in fine gray fur and renowned for their bureaucratic precision, and a human. A hegemony-affiliated human in a gray HSF administrative jacket, which is a thing that exists and which most humans on stations like Varen Station consider a particular kind of betrayal. His name was Callan, Dermot Callan. I'd seen him around the station. He processed docking permits. The Melvari opened a document on her tablet. She spoke in hegemony standard, which I understand adequately. Marcus Dalen Voss, she said. Registered human dock worker, Outer Rim Colony 9, Varen Station. You are cited under Hegemony Biological Exchange Accord, Statute 7, subsection 14, which prohibits unauthorized voluntary biological material exchange between provisional member species and restricted species without prior written approval from the relevant species councils. I helped someone who was hurt, I said. The act of sharing, as defined under. She was bleeding, I said. She'd been hurt by an HSF patrol, and she was alone in a corridor bleeding. I helped her. Groth made a small sound. Among Krath, that sound means something. I didn't know what it meant then, I do now. It means something like proceed carefully. Callan leaned forward. Look, he said in English in a low voice like he was doing me a favor. This can be a small thing, a fine. An annotation in your file. You acknowledge the statute, you pay the administrative fine, this goes away. I'm not acknowledging that helping someone bleeding in a corridor is a violation, I said. He gave me a look. The look said, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Where is the veil female? The Melvari asked. I don't know, I said, which was technically true. Saren had left my unit 2 days earlier, and I didn't know where she'd gone. That was the first compliance review. There were 4 more over the following 6 weeks. Each one escalated slightly. The questions got more specific. The documentation they cited got more extensive. At the 3rd review, a hegemony legal representative attended. A tall, many-limbed species called a Torathi, who are known as the galaxy's most meticulous legal minds, which is either impressive or terrifying depending on whether they're on your side. This one was not on my side. I started doing something at this point that I should mention because it matters later. I started taking notes. I had a small personal recorder. Dock workers use them to log cargo discrepancies, and after every review, I sat in my unit and recorded everything I remembered. Every question, every statute cited, every name. Not because I had any plan, just because documenting things felt like the only form of control I had. Saren came back. 11 days after she'd left, I came home from 3rd shift, and she was sitting outside my unit door, back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of her, the same position she'd been in when I found her in the corridor. But this time she wasn't wounded. You're still here, she said. I live here, I said. They haven't removed your registration. They've tried to find me. I haven't paid. She looked at me. That's inadvisable, she said. Probably, I said. I unlocked the door. She came inside. We sat at my small table, and she told me things then. Things about the Vale situation on Varen Station specifically, and the wider hegemony territory generally. There were Vales scattered across 43 stations in the Outer Rim. Most in the same situation, provisional status, restricted by Statute 7, unable to legally obtain what they needed. Some had found workarounds. Black market. There are always black markets. But the black market options for the sharing were dangerous, unregulated, without consent protocols, occasionally violent. Some Vale were just quietly dying. Not dramatically, just slowly. Running low, becoming less. The Vale don't die suddenly from deprivation, they diminish. They become less cognitively sharp, less physically present, less themselves. It can take years, but the end is the same. How many? I asked. She told me a number. I wrote it down. Here's something that happened to me around week 3 that I've never talked about in any official testimony because I wasn't sure how to explain it, and I was worried it would make everything seem mystical instead of biological. But I'm going to talk about it now. My senses changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but I started noticing things I hadn't noticed before. Sounds at the edge of my hearing range that I'd been filtering out became distinct. The hum of the atmospheric recyclers, which I'd learned to ignore, suddenly had a texture to it. I could hear individual mechanical components within it. The amber maintenance lights, which I'd always perceived as flat and orange, started showing me color variation. Warm gold here, cooler amber there. And smell. On a space station, everything smells like recycled atmosphere and machinery and 100 species of cooking. I've been living in that smell for 6 years and I'd stopped perceiving most of it. Now it layered. I could smell, and this is hard to describe, emotional states. Not perfectly, not the way the veil apparently can, but in a vague directional way, like being able to tell that something is spicy without knowing which spice. Fear has a metallic quality, I learned that. And something else, something I didn't tell Saren right away because I wasn't sure it was real. When HSF patrols came near me on the corridor, when I heard the deliberate heavy footsteps of Krath soldiers, I felt it before I heard it. A pressure, like a change in air density. My body knew before my brain did. I started talking to Saren about this. She listened very carefully. The recognition, she said finally, is more advanced than I expected. Is that good or bad? It means the compatibility is very high, she said. Historically, in very old Veil records, this level of recognition has been documented. It's called the deep mark. It's rare even among Veil bonding. Among Veil and another species, she paused. There are 3 recorded cases, total, in 600 years of hegemony history. What happened to those people? 2 of them are the reason the sharing accord was originally written 300 years ago, she said, before it was revised into Statute 7. I sat with that. And the 3rd? She was quiet for a moment. The 3rd, she said, founded the first interspecies medical exchange program, which the hegemony shut down in year 4 of its operation. 8 weeks after the first compliance review, the hegemony standard force came to my unit with something that was not a compliance review. It was an arrest warrant. Specifically, criminal violation of Statute 7, subsection 14, with an additional charge I hadn't seen before: deliberate provocation of species restriction enforcement mechanisms, which is a real hegemony statute, and it means, in practical terms, that they decided I wasn't just someone who'd accidentally helped a Veil. They decided I was doing it on purpose as an act of defiance. I was, by that point, doing it on purpose as an act of defiance. But they hadn't had evidence of that when they filed the warrant, so the charge was retrospective and arguably invented, which I noted in my recorder and which became relevant later. They took me to the inner ring processing facility. I was processed by a hegemony intake officer, had my dock registration suspended, and was placed in a holding facility that was, and I'm going to be precise here, not designed for humans. The gravity was full standard, not 0.7. The lighting was Krath standard blue-white. The food provided was Krath standard ration packs, which are nutritionally adequate for humans but have a flavor that I can only describe as what would happen if someone mixed motor oil with chalk dust and added a faint smell of ammonia. I was there for 4 days before a legal representative showed up. Not the Torathi, a different legal representative. Her name was Vress. She was a Melvari, same species as the administrative officer from the first compliance review, but very different in demeanor. She was small, as all Melvari are, with the fine gray fur and the round, intelligent face, and she moved with a precise efficiency that I associate with people who are very good at what they do and know it. She'd been hired, she told me, by a coalition. What coalition? I asked. Several interested parties, she said. I'll explain as we proceed. First, I need your recordings. How did you know I had recordings? She gave me a look that communicated politely that this was a very obvious question. I gave her the recordings. She listened to all of them, right there in the consultation room. It took 2 hours. I sat across from her and ate the chalk motor oil ration pack and watched her face, which gave away nothing, because Melvari are exceptional at neutral expressions. When she finished, she set the recorder down. You've documented 4 instances of procedural irregularity, she said. I didn't know what I was documenting, I said. I was just writing things down. Statute 7, subsection 14, as applied to your case, requires prior establishment of intent, she said. The HSF applied it retroactively, which is not permitted under Hegemony Administrative Law, Chapter 9, as revised in the Accord of 42. Additionally, the charge of deliberate provocation requires evidence of a pattern of behavior documented prior to the charge, which means at minimum 2 separate witnessed incidents. They have one, the original event in the corridor. What happens because of that? The arrest warrant has procedural defects, she said. I'm filing for immediate release on those grounds. You'll be out tonight. But Marcus, she folded her hands on the table. This is larger than your release. Tell me, I said. The coalition Vress represented turned out to include 3 veil advocacy organizations operating in legal gray areas across the Outer Rim, 1 hegemony internal review body that had been quietly investigating HSF conduct on Outer Rim stations for 18 months, and I mean quietly, internally, because there were council members who knew about the HSF overreach and wanted documentation before they moved. 2 human provisional member advocacy groups, one based on Varon Station and one based in a closer-in station called Hareth Point, and 1 Torathi legal firm, different from the one the HSF had been using against me, called the Sarvath Institute, which is, Vress told me, the most respected legal practice in hegemony space, and takes approximately 4 pro bono cases per decade. I was one of those cases. When she told me that, I sat quietly for a moment. Why? I asked. Because, Vress said, you have the deep mark. I stared at her. You know about that? The veil organizations know, she said. Saren told them, 3 days after she left your unit. That's when the coalition began forming. She left to tell them, I said, not a question, putting it together. Yes. She knew what this could become. She hoped, Vress said. She didn't know. None of us knew you'd be arrested. We thought perhaps a fine, a public statement, at most a compliance hearing with media attention. But the HSF's decision to arrest and apply the provocation charge, Vress made a small Melvari expression that functioned as a wry smile. That was a gift, procedurally speaking. I spent 4 days eating chalk, I said. Yes, she said. I'm sorry about that. They released me that night. I walked out of the processing facility, and Saren was standing in the corridor outside it. She looked different from how she'd looked when I found her bleeding. She was still the same, still the pale, luminescent skin and the dark eyes with the amber rim, still that quality of being made from light that's slightly colder than it should be. But she was standing straight. She was present in a way she hadn't been when I'd first met her, when she'd been surviving on whatever she'd managed, wherever she'd managed it. You look better, I said. The coalition, she said. There are 12 of us on the station. There are humans who have agreed, voluntarily, quietly. Good, I said. We stood in the corridor for a moment. I'm sorry, she said, for what the recognition did to you without your knowledge, and for what I didn't tell you, and for, she gestured at the processing facility behind me. You didn't put me in there, I said. The HSF did. My existence put you in proximity to. Saren, I said, stop. You were bleeding in a corridor. I helped you. I'd do it again. She looked at me for a long moment. The mark, she said, how is it? My hearing is very good now, I said. I can smell fear. I don't fully love that, but it's useful. A small sound from her, almost a laugh. Almost. It will continue to develop, she said. Slowly, you should know what to expect. Tell me over food, I said. Real food. Not chalk. The tribunal hearing took place on Hareth Point Station, 3 months after my arrest. Hareth Point is bigger than Varon. It's a full Class 3 station, with 6 rings and a permanent population of about 40,000, and it has a hegemony judicial hall in the inner ring, which I'd never seen before and which is genuinely impressive in the way that buildings built to impress people are impressive. The hall is a large circular chamber. The ceiling is transparent, actual transparent panels, showing open space, which is an architectural choice that either suggests a profound connection to the cosmos or a desire to make the people in the room feel small. Probably both. The tribunal was composed of 5 members, a Krath High Prefect, a Melvari Chief Administrative Judge, a Torathi Senior Advocate serving as Judicial Observer, a representative from the Hegemony Medical and Biological Sciences Council, a species I'd never encountered before called the Vashari, who look like, I'll just say they look like a nautilus shell learned to walk and developed opinions, and a human judge, on a hegemony tribunal. I didn't know that was possible, and Vres told me it was technically possible under provisional member emergency provisions, which had never been invoked before in 31 years of human provisional membership. The human judge's name was Dr. Annaline Strauss. She was 60-something, gray-haired, formerly a Hegemony Medical Council representative, currently retired, and she'd been nominated by the Sarvath Institute as the Human Judicial Observer under a procedural provision I still don't fully understand. I liked her immediately. She had the face of someone who had spent a long time watching people be wrong about things. I'm not going to recount the entire hearing. It lasted 9 days and covered a lot of legal ground that I understood about 40% of in real time and understood better afterward when Vres walked me through the summaries. What I'll tell you is the key moments. Day 2, the HSF presented their case. The primary legal argument was that Statute 7, subsection 14, exists for the protection of provisional member citizens, humans specifically, from potentially non-consensual biological interaction with restricted species. That I, as a human, had been victimized by veiled biological manipulation in the form of the recognition, which was itself evidence of the need for the statute. On day 3, Vres presented our response. It began with my recordings, every word of every compliance review, every procedural error, the retroactive application of charges, the invented pattern requirement, the 4-day detention in a facility not suitable for humans. Then she called the first witness. Saren. Saren testified for the better part of 2 days. She described the Vale situation on Varon Station. She described finding herself in the maintenance corridor, how she'd been stopped by an HSF patrol while trying to reach a prearranged voluntary sharing appointment with a Melvari resident who'd agreed to provide a small amount of biological material for a fee. How the patrol had found her donor materials, a small sealed container, and interpreted it as evidence of illegal activity. How the patrol officer, she identified him by designation number, not name, had used a Krath ceremonial blade to make a point. The ceremonial blade is technically prohibited as a HSF enforcement tool. She described my arriving. She described asking for the sharing. She described, and here she stopped, and there was a pause in the chamber, and I watched her breathe, not telling me fully about the recognition. Why did you not disclose this to the donor? the Melvari judge asked. Saren held herself very still. Because I needed to live, she said, and I should have found another way to ask or told him and risked refusal. Either of those would have been the right thing. I chose my survival over his full knowledge. I'm not going to make a case for why that was acceptable. It wasn't. It was what I did. The chamber was very quiet. Would the donor have agreed had you disclosed fully? The Krath High Prefect asked. Saren looked at me across the chamber. You'd have to ask him, she said. They asked me. Day 5, my testimony. The Krath High Prefect asked the question directly. Had you been fully informed of the potential biological consequence to yourself, the recognition, would you have provided the sharing? I thought about that honestly, there in the chamber. I don't know, I said. That's the real answer. I might have said no in that moment because I didn't know what it was and fear of the unknown is real, but I paused. She was dying, in a corridor, because an HSF patrol hurt her for trying to sustain herself. In that moment, with her sitting there bleeding with those facts in front of me, I think I would have said yes. Because the thing that was stopping me from saying yes would have been a fear of something I didn't understand, and the thing pushing me toward yes was right in front of me. Dr. Strauss, the human judge, asked, "Do you resent what happened to you, the change you didn't consent to?" I looked at my hands. The cut had healed long ago. There was no scar, faster than normal. That was the first change I'd noticed. I don't know how to resent something, I said slowly. That didn't make me less, it made me more. My hearing is better. My senses are fuller. I heal faster. I can perceive things I couldn't perceive before. I didn't consent to it, that's true, and consent matters. It matters enormously, and Saren has told me she was wrong not to disclose, and I believe her. But the thing itself, I paused. I'm not less human, I'm still Marcus Voss. I work the docks. I make bad coffee. I take shortcuts through maintenance corridors. The recognition didn't erase those things. It just added to them. Dr. Strauss held my gaze for a long moment. Thank you, she said. Day 7 was the one that changed everything. The Vashari Medical Council representative, whose name translated roughly to Three World, which is a Vashari naming convention based on the arrangement of shell chambers, presented a medical analysis of the recognition. I'd been examined by a hegemony medical team during the pre-tribunal process. Blood samples, sensory tests, neurological scans. Three World presented the results. The deep mark, Three World's analysis confirmed, was genuine and advanced. The biological compatibility between my physiology and Saren's was, he said in the careful language of scientific presentations, statistically extraordinary. Among all documented sharing interactions in hegemony medical history, and there were records going back 400 years, this level of compatibility had been recorded twice. Both of those previous instances had been used as the basis for the original sharing accord, before it was restricted into Statute 7. What the records show, Three World said, and here the chamber was very still, is that in both prior instances of the deep mark, the biological exchange resulted in measurable benefits to both parties. The Veil donors' long-term health outcomes were significantly improved. The non-Veil recipients' outcomes were also significantly improved, increased healing rate, extended lifespan projections, enhanced sensory processing. And the current instance, the Melvari judge said. Preliminary data suggests similar outcomes, Three World said. The human subject's healing rate has increased by approximately 40% over baseline. His sensory acuity has expanded measurably into ranges previously documented only in Veil subjects. Projected lifespan extension is uncertain but significant. A pause. And the Veil subject's biological stability, which had been deteriorating due to prolonged deprivation, has shown marked improvement since the sharing event. The HSF advocate stood. The tribunal should note that none of these outcomes justify a violation of. On day 9, the tribunal delivered findings. I'll summarize, because the full text runs to 47 pages of hegemony legalese that Vress spent 3 weeks translating into something I could read. The arrest, procedurally invalid. The provocation charge, dismissed for failure to meet the burden of prior documentation. The original statute 7 citation, reduced to a documented event with no penalty, on the grounds that the act had been undertaken in good faith as emergency humanitarian assistance. Then the part that wasn't about me. The tribunal's second finding, which was technically advisory, not binding, but which landed like a stone thrown into still water, was a formal recommendation to the Hegemony High Council for a review of Statute 7, subsection 14, in the context of Outer Rim provisional member populations. Specifically, that the blanket prohibition of the sharing applied to Veil provisional members in Outer Rim territories where no legal pathway to voluntary exchange existed, constituted, and I'm quoting from the tribunal document here, which I'm allowed to quote from because it's a public record, a systematic deprivation of biological necessity that rises to the threshold of inhumane treatment under hegemony, accord Section 3. The HSF advocate looked like someone had put him in zero gravity without warning. The Krath High Prefect said nothing. Among Krath, saying nothing is a statement. I walked out of the tribunal chamber with Vress on one side and Saren on the other, and I'm going to tell you what I was actually thinking in that moment, because it's probably not what you'd expect. I was thinking about my jacket, the work jacket I'd taken off and pressed against Saren's wound in the maintenance corridor. I'd never gotten the blood out of it entirely. There was still a faint shadow of it on the lining. I'd thought about throwing the jacket away a dozen times and I'd never done it. I don't know why I was thinking about that in that moment. Maybe because the jacket was the actual event and everything else. The compliance reviews, the arrest, the 4 days of chalk rations, the 9-day tribunal was the consequence of a decision made in 45 seconds in a dark corridor. 45 seconds. I pressed a jacket against a wound. And here we were. The 6 months after the tribunal are harder to narrate in sequence because they happened in many places at once, and I was only present in one of them. What I was present for. The High Council received the tribunal's recommendation. This caused what Vress described as significant procedural turbulence, which I understood to mean that a lot of very powerful beings were deeply unhappy about it. The HSF issued a formal complaint against the tribunal's composition, specifically against Dr. Strauss's inclusion, arguing that the human provisional member emergency provision had been misapplied. This complaint was reviewed by the Sarvath Institute and dismissed on grounds I still find satisfying, that if the provision had been misapplied, the HSF should have objected before the tribunal began rather than after it produced an outcome they didn't like. The Veil advocacy organizations, which had been operating in legal gray areas, remember, came into the light, cautiously, a few at a time. They began presenting formal petitions to the High Council, organized, documented, citing the tribunal's findings. 3 Worrell, the Vashari medical representative, filed an independent analysis to the medical council that built on his tribunal testimony and formally proposed a revision to the sharing accord framework. And on Varen Station, something happened that I didn't hear about until later. 12 humans voluntarily registered with the Veil Advocacy Network. They filed paperwork, proper, above-board, documented paperwork, citing the tribunal findings as their basis, stating their willingness to participate in voluntary sharing exchanges pending any legal revision. 12. On one station. Within a week, similar registrations began appearing on 6 other Outer Rim stations. I went back to Varen Station 2 weeks after the tribunal. My dock registration had been restored. My housing unit was still mine. They'd suspended my lease during the arrest, and I'd been half expecting to come back to a cleared-out space. But apparently there were enough procedural protections around provisional member housing that they couldn't do it cleanly. The unit was exactly as I'd left it, 12 square meters, the window looking across to the far side of the cylinder, the coffee substitute maker. I sat at my small table and turned the recorder on and said, Marcus Dalen Voss, Varen Station, Section 14B, Unit 47. It's been 9 months and 14 days since I walked through Maintenance Corridor 7 on the way home from third shift. I don't entirely know what the next part is. I know what happened. I don't know what comes next. I suppose that's most of life. I turned the recorder off. Here's what came next over the following year. The High Council review of Statute 7 took 14 months. I'm not going to pretend I understand every detail of what happened in those 14 months of deliberation. What I know is that the Sarvath Institute submitted a 900-page legal brief. That three-worlds medical analysis was cited 37 times in the final council deliberations. That Saren testified before a council subcommittee via transmission from an undisclosed location, which meant I watched her testimony on a screen in my housing unit while drinking bad coffee substitute at 04:00 station time. She was extraordinary. She spoke for 4 hours. She spoke about the biology of the veil with a precision that made the medical council representative lean forward. She spoke about the history of the sharing accord, the original one, before the revision, and cited sources that the council's own historians had to scramble to verify. She spoke about what deprivation had done to her people on outer rim stations, in plain language, without drama. At one point, a council member, a Krath, a senior one, the kind of Krath who have so much rank that their chitinous plating has been ceremonially marked, asked her, "What would you have the council know that it currently does not?" Saren said, "That we are not asking for privilege. We are asking for recognition. We existed before your hegemony. We joined your hegemony voluntarily. We accepted your laws in good faith. What we are asking is for those laws to reflect the same good faith toward us." 14 seconds of silence in the council chamber. Then the senior Krath said, in Krath, not hegemony standard in Krath, which is a language they use among themselves and rarely use in formal proceedings, something that Vres later translated for me as, "This is correct, and we have known it." The revised statute, formerly called the Biological Exchange Recognition Act, which the media immediately shortened to the BERA, passed the High Council in month 16. I am not going to claim that I was the reason it passed. The Veil advocacy organizations, Three World, the Sarvath Institute, Dr. Strauss, Vres, the human registrants on 6 outer rim stations, and a lot of other people I've never met did most of the actual work. But the clause they named after me, and I genuinely did not know they were going to do this, they announced it and I found out along with everyone else, is real. It's in the BERA. It's called the Voss provision. It says, in the legal language that Vres eventually translated into something human-shaped for me, that emergency humanitarian assistance provided in good faith between any two hegemony members, provisional or full, cannot be criminalized after the fact on the basis of species restriction statutes, unless there is documented evidence of predatory intent. Good faith assistance can't be criminalized. It took 45 seconds in a dark corridor to put those words in a hegemony statute. It took 16 months of tribunals and hearings and legal briefs and council deliberations to actually put them there. But there are 43 stations with Veil populations living in conditions that the BERA hasn't fixed yet, because law passing and law implementation are two different things, and the gap between them is where a lot of suffering still lives. I know this because I'm still writing things down. I've been writing things down since a compliance review officer told me to acknowledge a statute I didn't think was right. I've gotten better at it. After the BERA passed, Vress asked me if I'd be willing to write a formal account of the full sequence of events. The corridor, the compliance reviews, the arrest, the tribunal for the Interspecies Accord Commission archive. They wanted it in the public record, a human account in plain language of what had happened. I said yes. This document is that account, or most of it. I've edited some things slightly for clarity, and I've left some things out because they're not mine to put in, but the core of it is exactly what happened. Here's what my life looks like now. I still live in Section 14B, Unit 47. The window still looks across the cylinder. The coffee substitute maker still makes something that is technically coffee but isn't. I'm still a dock worker, third shift. I like third shift. I like the quiet of it, the amber lights, the sound of the recyclers. I know those sounds better now than I used to. I can hear things in the machinery before they become problems, and I've flagged 6 maintenance issues in the past year that I would have missed before. My supervisor thinks I'm an unusually attentive worker. I have not fully explained. My hearing keeps developing. My healing rate is sometimes this surprises me. A cargo strap snapped last month and caught me across the forearm hard enough that it should have left a significant bruise. By the end of my shift, it was gone. My colleague Preddy, who is Melvari and has worked the docks for 20 years, noticed and didn't say anything for 3 days. Then he said quietly, without looking up from the cargo manifest, "Veil touched." I said yes. He said, "Does it hurt?" I said no. He said, "Good," and went back to the manifest. That was the entire conversation, and it was perfect. Saren. I'll tell you about Saren. She's not on Varen Station anymore. She's on Harath Point, the bigger station, where the tribunal was, where she has access to the Advocacy Network's operational center, and where the legal work is ongoing. She's been appointed a formal liaison to the Interspecies Accord Commission's Biological Exchange Implementation Committee, which is the body tasked with actually making the BERA work on the ground, station by station. She's extraordinary at it. I knew she would be. I saw her testify for 4 hours, and I watched her make a senior Crath Council member speak in his own language, because she'd said something so precisely true that it bypassed his diplomatic training. We are in contact, regularly. It's not the kind of relationship that has an easy label. We are in contact. She tells me things she's working on. I tell her things from the docks. She has said more than once in that careful way she has, that the recognition creates a kind of presence she can sense across distances. Not communication, not mind reading, just a presence, like knowing a room is occupied without seeing inside it. I've noticed the same thing. Not from her specifically. I don't know her biological signature the way a fully Veil-recognized pair would, because I'm not Veil, and the recognition for me is different. But there's a quality to my perception now that includes something I didn't have before. A fullness. Like a room that used to feel empty now has something in it. I don't know how to describe it better than that. The changes continue developing, slowly. The Vashari medical team, 3 Worlds Research Group, have been studying my case as part of a broader study on cross-species biological recognition. I do regular check-ins, blood samples, sensory assessments, neurological scans. 3 Worlds sends me preliminary findings sometimes, written in Vashari medical notation with a human language summary attached, because he's thoughtful like that. The most recent summary said, subject continues to demonstrate stable and progressive development. No adverse outcomes identified. Sensory expansion now encompasses approximately 63% of Veil standard range, significantly higher than the documented prior cases in historical record. Healing acceleration remains consistent. Long-term projections remain favorable. There's something here we don't fully understand yet. We intend to continue studying it. I read that last line about 12 times. There's something here we don't fully understand yet. I find that more comforting than alarming, which might say something about me. 6 weeks ago, I was walking home through Maintenance Corridor 7. I still take that shortcut. It still saves 12 minutes. The recyclers still exhale at 0400 station time. The amber lights are still on their lowest setting. I was about 2/3 of the way through when I heard something. Not a person this time. A sound from one of the maintenance panels, a specific mechanical irregularity in the recycler cycling. A 3 Hz deviation in the primary exhaust rhythm that suggested a blockage in the secondary purge line. I stopped, I crouched down, I found the panel. I opened it with my multi-tool. I cleared the blockage, debris accumulation, nothing dramatic, and closed the panel. The recycler resumed its normal rhythm. I stood up. I thought about the fact that 6 months ago I wouldn't have heard that. I thought about the fact that if I hadn't heard it and the blockage had continued, it would have become a Category 2 atmospheric failure in about 18 hours, which on a space station means evacuation of a section, temporary loss of atmo pressure in the affected corridor, and a repair job that takes 2 days and 12 technicians. I thought about the 45 seconds in this same corridor, a year and a half ago, when I heard breathing instead of a mechanical fault, and I stopped.